Oh man, I wonder what YouTube's up to today.
Hi boys, it's me again.
Hey logical listeners, I hope that you guys are having a great day today. I am going to be filming an unusual video today. I wanted to use bits and pieces from Contrapoints' latest video, which is called Men, as well as bits and pieces from other videos to talk about something that I have yet to see anyone really talk about. I wrote an article about this for The Humanist a while ago that will be in the description, but I'm going to be talking about the demonization of young male immigrants and refugees. And I'm going to be talking about it because I think it's an important thing to talk about that I don't see that many people particularly talking about. I didn't see it in the past, and I'm definitely not really seeing it today, so I actually wanted to give it a shot, and I wanted to encourage people to think about it a little bit, and I wanted to encourage people to have conversations about it. I'll be putting Contrapoints' video in the description, as well as using clips from it to, I guess, sort of buttress some of my points. So, that said, I hope that you guys are ready to have what will hopefully be a neat conversation. I'm going to start off by pointing out that there is a long history of rhetoric around immigrants being particularly negative and often extremely gendered. And this history is something that I am going to demonstrate in a variety of different ways. I'm going to show you all screenshots of the idea that immigrants are overwhelmingly male and especially young, and also I'm going to show you videos that demonstrate lots of different people, but mostly conservatives, talking about immigrants as invaders and using militaristic language to describe and dehumanize and demonize immigrants and refugees. But this idea is also not new. This idea has been found throughout history, and it's an xenophobic fear that has manifested itself in various ways aimed at various different targets throughout history.
Imagine how many lives would be saved and how many rapes would be prevented if they actually were able to stop.
It's a health.
These are basically the Jacobins of the French Revolution now in the 21st century version. They are the stormtroopers of the deconstructionists.
Two men burning this American flag featuring a painted-on swastika.
All in support of the caravan, a poster image for building the wall along our southern border.
It is groups such as ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and they have declared war.
For a variety of reasons, a lot of the rhetoric that you just heard and a lot of the things that you just saw are directly tied to particular images. When people think of invaders, they don't often think of women. When people think of drug dealers and when people think of terrorists, they don't think of women. And I'm not making this video to dive into the weird sexism of that and the particular socializations that are necessary to create those sorts of conditions in the minds of listeners, but I'm making this video to demonstrate that there is rhetoric that is specifically aimed at targeting specific types of immigrants and refugees, and those specific types are often, but not always, male. Something that plays into a form of the idea of male disposability is the idea that men's intentions for immigrating are less noble and less deserving of sympathy than the motives of women and the motives of children. This is an especially destructive idea that is often applied to different types of refugees and to different types of immigrants. I was curious as to research that had been done to see the impact of descriptors on people's receptiveness to accepting refugees, and so I decided that the best thing for me to do would be for me to research what research was already out there. I found a particularly interesting Washington Post article that added a variety of descriptors to descriptions of refugees and examined how those descriptors changed people's receptiveness to admitting those refugees. And obviously certain receptors and certain descriptors were especially positive, and then other ones were especially negative. someone being a young adult male refugee was looked more down upon than someone who was a young female refugee, and someone who was a young Muslim male refugee was especially looked down upon. And obviously this is fascinating. I'll be linking the article in the description down below, and it's not conclusive or anything. I'm mostly talking about it to illustrate that there's evidence out there that bolsters this point, and it shows that specific types of refugees are looked down upon, and this is very unfortunate because it has a very real impact on our society, and it demonstrates something about us that we should be talking about.
For this video, I decided to actually do some research for once, and the first thing I did was read the foundational text of the modern men's rights movement, which is The Myth of Male Power by Warren Farrell. Actually, I listened to the audiobook because, let's be honest, reading is hard. But as I was listening, I admit I thought it made more sense than I was expecting it to. Basically, Farrell says that second-wave feminists rightly fought against the traditional gender role that confined women to domestic servitude. But he argues that the feminist idea that men have all the power in society is actually an illusion, because the traditional gender role for men is just as oppressive. He introduces the idea of male disposability, basically the idea that society values female lives more than male lives, which are seen as expendable in the service of protecting and providing for women and children. And he points to statistics showing that men make up the majority of military casualties, workplace fatalities, murder victims, suicides, and so on. So we're supposed to conclude that even though at first it looks like men have more power than women, in fact, the queens have a certain kind of privilege in being protected and provided for by the expendable male worker bees. And I guess that kind of makes sense. I feel like I can at least empathize with the point of view.
It was actually in watching Contrapoints' video that I got the idea to make the video that I'm making right now. And it's because I had never actually heard that idea from the segment that I just showed y'all articulated in so many words. It was in hearing that idea that I was able to think that that idea probably has something to do with people's visceral reactions to the ideas of male asylum seekers, male refugees, and male immigrants. I think it's because we have this sort of expectation that men in our own societies should be willing to do this. They should be willing to fight and die to protect women and children, and in some cases even other men from these sorts of evils. And when we see someone fleeing those sorts of evils, we think of women and children as being just victims of those. But when we see men, we see something more sinister. And I think it's important that there are people who are willing to articulate these sorts of ideas, because without hearing them out loud, it's oftentimes more difficult for us to conceptualize them in so many words. I know that until I heard Natalie / Contrapoints talk about that the way that she did just now, it was more difficult for me to actually get that idea in my head, that other people viewed men's role in society in this particular way. Because I don't think of men's role in society in that particular way.
It has to do with the way men and women are treated in public space. When you present female in public, you're more likely to be treated as a spectacle to be commented upon. People, usually men, will just blurt out their opinions about you. Sometimes complimentary, sometimes insulting, sometimes just fucking weird. Whereas, when you present male in public, you're more likely to be treated either as invisible or as dangerous.
This is an especially true point that is reinforced and redoubled for people who don't look like what a lot of Americans conceptualize as Americans. And throughout history, the particular group that looks less American than others has always been changing. But right now, the largest groups that look less American than others are often, but not always, Hispanic men and Arabic men. And for them, they are being told, and other people are being told, that they are dangerous and that they have nefarious objectives, and just generally that they're not great folks. And it doesn't actually really matter if they themselves believe it for the purpose of this. The problem is that other people might believe it, and in hearing it often enough, it's going to have a psychological impact on the people who listen to this sort of stuff. And in turn, those people's actions are going to have a psychological impact on the people who are affected by those people's actions. And it's just generally important that we start to reckon with the fact that we have been told for a while now that specific groups of people, specific groups of men are more dangerous than others, regardless of whether or not that is actually reflective of reality, because it doesn't have to be reflective of reality for it to have an impact on those people. And it also doesn't have to be something that they themselves hear for it to have an impact on them. If enough other people hear it and act on it, that they are affected en masse.
Men's greatest weakness is their facade of strength, and women's greatest strength is their facade of weakness. I think there is some truth to the idea that women's perceived vulnerability can make them powerful, and men's perceived power can make them vulnerable.
I do think that that idea is something that we should definitely be willing to apply to immigrant narratives and also to narratives about immigrants, because the reality is we do view immigrant narratives through gendered lenses, and obviously the extent to which we do this depends on a wide variety of factors, and also the impact that this has on our perceptions of the immigrant narratives can differ depending on our own gender, depending on the genders of the people affected, and also depending on the dominant cultural narratives going on around us. But this is an idea that's definitely worth considering and should absolutely be part of any analysis of both immigrant stories and also stories that are told from non-immigrant voices about immigrants. So all of that leaves us wondering, what can we do? And it's understandable to feel hopeless in this because we're faced off against a machine, a propaganda outputter that demonizes a specific group and does it well. And this group that is demonized is a group that isn't often brought to the forefront of these conversations. It's understandable to feel hopeless in this sort of situation, but ultimately this is something that we do need to confront, because the pain that we are forcing people to endure and the pain that we are not allowing people to express anything about is real pain, and it's real frustration, and it's actually dehumanizing, and it has an impact. Because this sort of media output does affect how it is that people feel about this group. So ultimately, we can't sit by and do nothing. We have to speak up, we have to speak out. And one of the things that we could do is we could actually talk about it. We could do what I'm doing right now, what I did earlier this year. And we can actually be like, hey, this is a real problem and it's something that is scary to people who are affected. But because we don't often see or hear from the affected parties, we don't understand that this isn't something that exists in a vacuum. This isn't just something that certain propaganda outlets are putting out there and that doesn't have a real impact on our societies, because this makes people less welcoming to a type of people whose voices are almost systemically not heard from. And ultimately, it's important that we do speak up, it's important that we do speak out, and it's important that we share perspectives. I think it's important that we acknowledge that the reasons why it is that male refugees choose to leave are just as noble and are just as selfless as the reason why it is that other people choose to leave as well. It can be somewhat frustrating to hear this, especially if we are not aware of how it is that our silence affects this, but our silence does have a real impact on this. And the reality is, it's not just these affected parties that are affected, it's anyone who might be a member of an affected party. Because the reality is, I have friends and I know people, I have family members who look a lot more Hispanic than I do. I am fully Hispanic. I was raised in Latin America, but I am fairly white passing, and there are a lot of people who don't look at me and see someone who is Hispanic, but they look at my family members, they look at my grandparents, they look at my parents, and they see people who are Hispanic and they treat them as such. I have heard people tell me that I should speak English. I have heard people tell me to go back to my country, but the reality is that there are other people who look a lot more Hispanic than I do, who hear that a lot more regularly than I do. Even though I speak Spanish in public pretty frequently. And I live in a place, and before I was living in a place that was fairly accepting of both of these things, but that didn't stop people from telling me to speak English. That didn't stop people from telling me to go back to where I came from. This is something that a lot of different Hispanic people have experienced. It's something that a lot of people of different skin colors and a lot of people of darker skin colors have experienced. We can't afford to stay silent on this. The more we stay silent, the more people are going to be negatively affected. So even though it might make us uncomfortable, it is time that we sit down and that we have a conversation about these sorts of things. I know that in making this video, I am probably just beginning a conversation as opposed to making a definitive video on this topic, but I do hope to make more videos that talk about this, and in time to make videos that talk about this in better ways than this video did. But I am happy to be here. I'm happy to be starting this sort of a conversation on my channel, and I hope that in time we can create a society that is accepting and welcoming to male refugees just as much as it is to women and to children. And this doesn't mean that we have to pretend that all of those problems are precisely equal, but it does mean that we should be willing to accept that men who leave a variety of different countries are fleeing real violence, and that they're doing what they view as the best things that they can be doing for their families and for their friends and for their communities by going to other places, that they are just as likely to be kind-hearted people as other sorts of refugees are. Because if we stay silent and if we don't do anything, then we're just perpetuating these cycles of silence and oftentimes of hatred. And we're making it harder for people to want to speak out against these, because it's always difficult to be the first person to say something. It's always difficult to be the first person to raise your hand, but it's important to be the first person to raise your hand. It's important to be a voice that's out there that's saying that, like, hey, I'm not going to sit idly by while this is happening. I hope that y'all have a great day. I hope that y'all enjoyed this video. I know it was definitely different from what I normally do, but I'm hoping to make more videos like this, and I'm hoping that I can get better at it over time. Bye, friends.